Adapt, Why Success Always Starts with Failure, by Tim Harford. Introduction. Imagine for a moment deciding to build a simple, everyday toaster. From scratch. I don't mean assembling a kit. I mean really from scratch. Starting with nothing but dirt and rock. A young design student named Thomas Thwaites actually tried this. He thought, how hard could it be? A toaster is a century-old technology, cheap and reliable. But when he took one apart, he found over 400 different components. He needed copper for the wires, iron for the steel grill, nickel for the heating element, and plastic for the casing. The journey that followed was a descent into a kind of beautiful madness. To get iron, he had to travel to an old mine in Wales, now a museum. He tried to smelt the ore using 15th century technology and failed miserably. He even tried using hair dryers and leaf blowers, and then 2 microwave ovens, one of which melted in the attempt, just to produce a lump of iron the size of a coin. Plastic was no easier. He couldn't get crude oil, so he tried making it from potato starch, only to have his efforts eaten by snails. He finally had to cheat, scavenging plastic from a local dump. After months of Herculean effort, crisscrossing the country, battling ancient technologies and modern regulations, he finally assembled his creation. It looked less like a toaster and more like a lumpy, half-melted birthday cake. He summoned his courage, plugged it into the wall socket, and, 2 seconds later, it was toast. The entire device melted into a useless lump. This simple, almost comical failure holds a secret. A profound secret about why our modern world works at all, and why solving our biggest problems, from climate change to financial crises, and even the challenges in our own lives, is so incredibly difficult. We live in a world so complex that no single person, no matter how brilliant, can comprehend it, let alone build a simple toaster from the ground up. In his brilliant book, Adapt, the economist and storyteller Tim Harford takes us on a journey to uncover this secret. Harford is one of those rare thinkers who can see the hidden patterns that connect a failed toaster, a disastrous war, and a Nobel Prize-winning discovery. He argues that our instinct to solve problems is all wrong. We look for perfect plans, visionary leaders, and flawless experts. But success, he reveals, doesn't come from avoiding failure. It comes directly from failure. By the end of our time together today, you will understand the 3 essential principles that govern success in any complex system. You will see why the most successful organizations in the world are not the ones that have the best plans, but the ones that are best at learning from their mistakes. And you will have a powerful new framework for tackling the challenges in your own life, not by trying to be perfect, but by learning how to fail well. This isn't just a book summary, it's a guide to a new way of thinking. Book summary. We all have an instinct, a deep-seated belief, that when we face a complex problem, what we need is a brilliant leader. Someone who can see the big picture, create a master plan, and command everyone to execute it perfectly. We elect presidents who promise to change everything, and then we're disappointed when they can't. We celebrate CEOs with grand visions, and then we're shocked when their companies falter. But what if this instinct is fundamentally wrong? The psychologist Philip Tetlock spent 20 years studying this very question. He gathered nearly 300 of the world's top experts, political scientists, economists, intelligence analysts, and asked them to make specific, quantifiable predictions about the future. He asked them over 27,000 questions in total. And what he found was humbling. These brilliant minds, the people who advise presidents and run global corporations, were shockingly bad at predicting what would happen next. The more famous the expert, the worse their predictions tended to be. It's not that they were stupid. The problem wasn't the experts, the problem was the world. It is simply too complicated for anyone to fully understand, let alone predict. This is the lesson of Thomas Thwaites' toaster. If one man can't even comprehend a simple household appliance, how can one leader possibly comprehend how to end poverty, or fight a war, or design a perfect economy? The answer, Tim Harford argues, is that they can't. And the systems that succeed are the ones that don't rely on a single, perfect plan. Instead, they rely on a process. A messy, chaotic, and powerful process that has a name: evolution. Evolution is often summarized as survival of the fittest, but it's more accurate to call it the failure of the less fit. It works through a simple, relentless algorithm: variation and selection. Try lots of different things, and see what works. The things that fail are discarded. The things that succeed are copied and built upon. Repeat, forever. There is no master plan. No grand designer. Just trial and error, on a massive scale. This is the hidden secret behind the incredible success of the market economy. We celebrate brilliant entrepreneurs and iconic companies like General Electric or Exxon, and we see them as symbols of success. But what we don't see is the vast, invisible graveyard of failures that made their success possible. For every surviving giant, there are thousands of companies that tried and failed. At the dawn of the automobile industry, there were 2,000 firms in the United States alone. Only about 1% of them survived. Today, 10% of all American companies disappear every single year. Failure isn't an unfortunate byproduct of a market system. It is the very engine that drives it forward. The difference between a thriving market economy and a centrally planned disaster is not that markets avoid failure. It's that they harness it. They allow for millions of small-scale experiments, and they provide a ruthless, efficient way of figuring out which ones are working. But what happens when a system is designed to prevent this process? What happens when a system is pathologically incapable of variation and selection? To understand that, we have to travel back to the early days of the Soviet Union and meet a man named Peter Palczynski. Palczynski was a brilliant engineer, a man of fierce integrity and almost absurd honesty. In the early 1900s, he was sent by the Tsar to study the coal mines in Russia's Don Basin. What he found horrified him. The miners were living in squalor, stacked like firewood in crowded bunks. His report was so politically explosive that he was exiled to Siberia. But Palczynski was a born learner. He escaped Russia, traveled across Europe, and soaked up every new idea he could find in engineering and management. He believed that the key to progress was to constantly seek out new ideas, to pay attention to local details, and to learn from what was happening on the ground. He eventually returned to Russia and became an advisor to the new Soviet government, but he refused to let politics distort his engineering advice. This stubborn honesty would prove fatal. When Stalin launched his first 5-year plan, Palczynski was assigned to two of its most massive projects, the Lenin Dam and the giant steel mills of Magnitogorsk. These were prestige projects, designed to be the largest in the world. But Palczynski warned against them. He argued for a more cautious, step-by-step approach. He pointed out that no one had done proper geological surveys. No one had considered the human cost. For the Lenin Dam, he warned that the reservoir would flood thousands of homes and prime farmland. For Magnitogorsk, a city to be built from scratch in the remote heart of Russia, he worried about the fate of the workers who would be sent there. His warnings were ignored. Stalin wanted the world's largest hydroelectric project, and the world's largest steel mills. He wanted a grand plan. The results were catastrophic, just as Palczynski had predicted. The Lenin Dam was an economic and engineering disaster. The city of Magnitogorsk was built by forced laborers, thousands of whom died in the first winter. Workers were housed downwind from the blast furnaces, choked by almost unfathomable pollution. Palczynski understood what the central planners in Moscow, with their maps and statistics, could not. that real-world problems are messy, complex, and have a human dimension. His approach could be summarized in 3 simple rules, what we can call the Palczynski principles. First, seek out new ideas and try new things. This is the principle of variation. Second, when trying something new, do it on a scale where failure is survivable. This is the principle of survivability. And third, seek out feedback and learn from your mistakes. This is the principle of selection. The Soviet system was a monument to the violation of all 3 principles. It couldn't tolerate a variety of approaches. It launched gigantic projects where failure was catastrophic. And most importantly, it ruthlessly suppressed feedback. In 1928, the secret police came for Peter Palczynski. He was executed without trial. His crime, according to a secret police dossier, was publishing detailed statistics and trying to set minimal goals. In other words, he was murdered for trying to figure out what would work, and for refusing to be silent when he saw what wouldn't. The economic flaw of the Soviet Union wasn't a lack of creative people, it was a pathological inability to adapt. 60 years after Palczynski's execution, coal miners in the very same Don Basin he had first studied went on strike, protesting the same grotesquely dangerous conditions he had warned about. The system had still failed to learn. This resistance to adaptation isn't unique to dictatorships. Most large traditional organizations, from governments to corporations, struggle with the same problem. They love grand projects. They prefer uniform standards. And they are terrible at listening to bad news. This brings us to one of the most remarkable stories of organizational adaptation in modern history, the turnaround of the U.S. military in Iraq. By 2006, the situation in Iraq was an unmitigated disaster. The country was descending into a brutal civil war. U.S. forces were isolated in massive forward operating bases, giant, fortified compounds in the desert, complete with Baskin-Robbins ice cream and swimming pools. From these concrete cocoons, they would conduct armored raids into cities, what one expert called day tripping like a tourist in hell. They would drive in, kill some suspected insurgents, and drive out, leaving the local population at the mercy of terrorists and militias. Anyone who cooperated with the Americans would be murdered the moment they left. The strategy was a catastrophic failure. Back in Washington, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld was in a state of denial. In a bizarre press conference, he declared he'd had an epiphany and would no longer use the word insurgents, instead calling them enemies of the legitimate Iraqi government. It was a perfect echo of the Soviet mindset: if reality contradicts the plan, deny reality. But on the ground, something was changing. A rebellion was starting, not against the U.S. Army, but within it. The rebellion was led by a handful of brave, unconventional colonels. One of them was a man named H.R. McMaster. McMaster was a war hero, but also a scholar. He had literally written the book on how failed leadership at the top had led to disaster in the Vietnam War. It was called Dereliction of Duty, and it was a blistering critique of how generals and politicians had created a system that was incapable of learning from its mistakes. In 2005, McMaster was given command of the city of Tal Afar, a stronghold for al-Qaeda in Iraq. The official strategy was to conduct sweeps from a nearby forward operating base. McMaster rejected it. He did the exact opposite. He moved his soldiers into the city. He abandoned the safe, air-conditioned megabase and established 29 small outposts throughout the city. His men lived among the people, sharing their risks. They had no hot water or swimming pools. They took heavy casualties. But then, a miracle happened. The people of Tal Afar, convinced that the Americans were there to stay and protect them, began to cooperate. They started turning in the terrorists. The insurgency collapsed with astonishing speed. McMaster's strategy was a direct violation of orders from his superiors. He was told to stop thinking strategically, in other words, to shut up and follow the failed plan. When he requested reinforcements, his request was never even passed up the chain of command. He was seen as a troublemaker, and he was twice passed over for promotion to general, a move that nearly ended his career. But McMaster wasn't alone. Other officers, like Colonel Sean McFarland in the city of Ramadi, were trying similar experiments. Good advice was being passed around from the bottom up, through emailed articles and even a witty PowerPoint presentation called How to Win the War in Al-Anbar by Captain Trav. These soldiers on the front line were adapting, experimenting, and learning, because for them, failure was not an abstract concept. It meant their friends died. The story of how this bottom-up rebellion eventually became the official strategy is a lesson in how even the most rigid hierarchy can be forced to adapt. The hero of this part of the story is General David Petraeus. When Petraeus was put in charge of rewriting the Army's doctrine on counterinsurgency, he didn't lock himself in a room and come up with a master plan. He did the opposite. He sought out the dissenters. He invited the mavericks, the critics, the troublemakers, including H.R. McMaster, who emailed feedback from the front lines in Tal Afar. Petraeus created a space for clashing perspectives, knowing that the best ideas emerge from debate, not from enforced unanimity. The new counterinsurgency manual that emerged was a revolutionary document. It was posted on the internet and downloaded over 1.5 million times in the first month. It spread through the Army from the bottom up, changing the way soldiers thought and acted. By the time President Bush finally replaced Donald Rumsfeld and put General Petraeus in command in Iraq, an internal revolution had already transformed the military. The turnaround in Iraq wasn't the result of a new leader with a new, perfect plan. It was the result of a painful, decentralized process of trial and error. It was chaotic, rebellious, and it violated every rule of a traditional, top-down organization. It was, in short, an adaptive system in action. This process of adaptation, of trying new things and seeing what works, is the key to solving complex problems. But where do the truly new ideas, the radical variations, come from in the first place? For that, we turn to another story of a desperate conflict, the Battle of Britain. In 1931, the British Air Ministry issued a request for a new fighter plane. At the time, the conventional wisdom was that bombers couldn't be stopped. The best defense was to have your own fleet of bombers for massive retaliation. But a few people in the ministry thought differently, and they put out a call for something new. The initial results were disappointing. But one of the competing firms, a disorganized little company called Supermarine, came back with a radical new design. It was so unconventional that it had to be funded outside the normal process. An enterprising civil servant named Air Commodore Henry Cave Brown Cave decided to order a prototype as a most interesting experiment. That plane was the Supermarine Spitfire. The Spitfire was a miracle of engineering. It was so fast and agile that it helped Britain's tiny Royal Air Force fight off the overwhelming force of the Nazi Luftwaffe, preventing an invasion that would have changed the course of history. It is only a small exaggeration to say the Spitfire was the plane that saved the free world. The prototype cost about the same as a nice house in London. What was the return on that investment? You can't calculate it. The value of saving hundreds of thousands of lives and denying Adolf Hitler the atomic bomb is immeasurable. The lesson of the Spitfire is not that the planners had a brilliant strategy. They didn't. Most of them were wrong. The lesson is that the system had enough flexibility, enough leeway, to allow a most interesting experiment to happen anyway. New ideas often need a safe haven to develop, a place where they are protected from the crushing weight of conventional wisdom. The biologist Charles Darwin found these safe havens in the Galapagos Islands, where isolated populations of finches and tortoises evolved into unique new species. In the world of innovation, these Galapagos Islands are often small, unconventional teams, shielded from the corporate bureaucracy. Lockheed's famous Skunk Works, which designed the U-2 spy plane and the stealth bomber, is a classic example. Reginald Mitchell, the genius designer of the Spitfire, worked in just such an environment. His team was a chaotic, fiercely independent group, protected from the committees of the larger company that owned them. But here's the problem: in our modern world, innovation is getting harder and more expensive. The burden of knowledge is growing. It takes longer for scientists and inventors to learn enough to start making breakthroughs. They have to specialize more narrowly, and they work in larger teams. We can't just wait for new ideas to emerge from student dorm rooms, like Google or Facebook did. For challenges like curing cancer or developing clean energy, we need a way to fund wildly experimental, expensive, long-shot projects. The traditional ways of doing this often fail. Government grants, like those from the National Institutes of Health, tend to be risk-averse. They are designed to produce a steady stream of solid, predictable science, not revolutionary breakthroughs. Just ask Mario Capacchi. In 1980, he applied for an NIH grant for 3 projects. 2 were safe bets. The third was wildly speculative. He wanted to figure out how to make a specific, targeted change to a single gene in a mouse's DNA. This was like trying to find and change a single sentence in a 70-volume encyclopedia at a molecular level. The NIH told him his idea was science fiction and strongly advised him to drop it. They funded his other 2 projects. What did Capacchi do? He took their money, ignored their advice, and poured almost all of it into his risky project. It was a huge gamble. If he failed, his career could have been ruined. In 2007, Mario Capacchi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine for that very work. His technique, called gene targeting, has revolutionized medical research. When the NIH renewed his funding years earlier, they admitted, "We are glad you didn't follow our advice." The moral of this story is not just that we should admire stubborn geniuses. It's that we shouldn't have to rely on them. We need a system that actively encourages these kinds of risky bets. And one of the most powerful ways to do that is through prizes. The idea is an old one. In the 18th century, the British government offered a massive prize for a method to determine a ship's longitude at sea. The scientific establishment, at the Royal Observatory, was convinced the answer lay in astronomy. They failed for decades. The prize was eventually claimed by a village carpenter named John Harrison, who built a clock of astonishing accuracy that could keep time at sea. Prizes work because they are open to anyone, and they only pay for results. They don't try to pick winners in advance. They simply state a goal and reward whoever reaches it. After falling out of fashion for centuries, prizes are making a comeback. Netflix offered a $1 million prize to anyone who could improve its movie recommendation algorithm. The X Prize Foundation offers large prizes for achievements like private spaceflight and sequencing the human genome. And a massive $1.5 billion prize has been created to develop a vaccine for pneumococcal diseases, which kill nearly 1 million children a year in poor countries. A prize allows for the ultimate combination, a completely open field for variation, where the boldest ideas can be tried, coupled with huge rewards for success. But this brings us to a final, critical question. The entire philosophy of ADAPT is built on the power of trial and error. But what if the cost of error is just too high? What if failure is not survivable? On the evening of July 6, 1988, on the Piper Alpha oil and gas rig in the North Sea, a series of small mundane errors began to cascade. A backup pump was started up while it was being maintained. A safety permit was misplaced. Gas leaked, ignited, and exploded. The explosion disabled the control room. Firefighting pumps, designed to start automatically, didn't, because of a safety measure meant to protect divers. 2 nearby rigs, seeing the inferno, continued to pump gas toward Piper Alpha, feeding the flames. Less than 2 hours after the first explosion, the entire rig collapsed into the sea. 167 men died. The financial system, it turns out, is a lot like a nuclear reactor or an offshore oil rig. The experts who study industrial accidents, like the sociologist Charles Perrow, have a term for systems like these. They call them complex and tightly coupled. Complex means there are many interacting parts, and it's impossible to foresee all the ways things can go wrong. Tightly coupled means that when one thing goes wrong, the consequences cascade through the system so quickly that there is no time to react or adapt. A line of dominoes is a simple example of a tightly coupled system. The global financial system is an infinitely more complex one. In these systems, Perrow argues, accidents are not just possible, they are normal. They are an inevitable consequence of the system's design. The 2008 financial crisis was a normal accident. So was the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. In both cases, a series of small, seemingly recoverable errors, a faulty valve, a misleading financial report, a battery with no power, lined up like holes in slices of Swiss cheese, creating a path for catastrophe. The instinctive response is to add more safety systems. But as we saw with Piper Alpha, safety systems themselves can introduce new, unexpected ways for things to go wrong. The financial innovations that were supposed to make the banking system safer, like credit default swaps, actually made it more complex and more tightly coupled. They acted like a safety harness that, instead of saving a falling mountaineer, pulls the rest of the team down with him. So if we can't eliminate failure, and we can't just pile on more safety systems, what is the answer? The answer is to decouple. To insert safety gates, like the ones used by professional domino topplers, that contain failures and prevent them from spreading. In the financial world, this means things like forcing banks to hold more capital, a thicker cushion against failure. It means creating better contingency plans for bankruptcy, so that a failing bank doesn't take the rest of the economy with it. And it might mean a more radical idea, like narrow banking, which would separate the essential, utility functions of banking, like ATMs and savings accounts, from the riskier, casino side. The goal is not to create a system that never fails. That is an impossible dream. The goal is to create a system where failures are survivable. To accept that errors will happen, and to design our most critical systems not with the arrogant assumption of perfection, but with the humble wisdom that comes from expecting mistakes. This is the ultimate lesson of adaptation. Whether we are designing a financial system, fighting a war, inventing a new technology, or simply trying to live a better life, the path forward is the same. It is not a straight line, but a winding process of discovery. It is a journey defined not by the absence of failure, but by the willingness to learn from it. Commentary. So what does all of this mean for you? For a young person standing at the beginning of a career, a life, full of complex and uncertain choices, it might seem that the lessons of military strategy or global finance are a world away from your own decisions. But they aren't. The same principles that govern these vast systems also govern our own lives. The world you are entering is more complex and fast-moving than any before it. The idea that you can map out a perfect career path, a grand 10-year plan, is a comforting illusion. The truth is, you can't. You don't have enough information about the world, and you don't even have enough information about the person you will become in 10 years. The message of Adapt is a liberating one. It gives you permission to stop trying to be perfect. It gives you permission to experiment, to explore, and yes, to fail. Consider the story of Twyla Tharp, one of the most brilliant and innovative choreographers of our time. In 2002, she created a new show called Movin' Out, a ballet set to the music of Billy Joel. It was an ambitious, high-profile project, backed by millions of dollars. It premiered in Chicago, and it was a disaster. Critics called it stupefyingly cliched and embarrassingly naive. Tharp was a legend. She was 61 years old. It would have been easy for her to retreat into denial, to blame the critics, to insist that the world simply didn't understand her masterpiece. This is the natural human reaction. We suffer from what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the intense mental discomfort of holding two contradictory thoughts at the same time. I am a brilliant choreographer, and my new show is a flop. To resolve this tension, we often choose to deny the evidence of our failure. But Tharp did something much harder, and much braver. She accepted the failure. She made peace with her losses. And then she got to work. In just 3 months, she tore the show apart and rebuilt it from the ground up, all while the cast was performing the old, failed show every night. How did she do it? She relied on what she called her validation squad, a small group of trusted friends and colleagues who would tell her the truth. The morning after the terrible reviews came out, she had breakfast with an old collaborator. Her friend didn't console her. She simply said, "You know they're right." That honest feedback was the selection mechanism she needed. It allowed her to see her own creation with clear eyes, to distinguish what was working from what wasn't. 3 months later, Movin' Out opened on Broadway to triumphant reviews. It won 2 Tony Awards, including one for Tharp. It was a stunning transformation, a testament to the power of adapting in the face of failure. Twyla Tharp's story shows us how to apply the 3 Palkinski principles to our own lives. First, try new things. Give yourself permission to be a beginner. Take on projects and experiences where you don't know the outcome. This is variation. Second, make failure survivable. Don't bet your entire life savings on a single, risky venture. Start with small steps. The out-of-town tryout for Movin' Out was a perfect example of a survivable experiment. It was public, but it wasn't Broadway. It gave Tharp the space to fail without destroying the entire project. And third, know when you've failed. This is the hardest part. It requires overcoming our own psychological defenses. It means building your own validation squad, people who care about you enough to give you honest feedback, not just praise. It means learning to separate your actions from your identity. A failed project doesn't make you a failure. It makes you a learner. The journey of life is a search across what the book calls a fitness landscape, a vast, shifting geography of peaks and valleys. The peaks are moments of success and fulfillment, the valleys are moments of failure and disappointment. We often admire the people who seem to make giant, heroic leaps, landing on a high summit. But for most of us, progress comes from a combination of small, tentative steps and occasional, calculated risks. It comes from climbing, sometimes stumbling, and always learning from the terrain. Embracing this process can feel frightening. It means accepting uncertainty. It means being wrong, a lot. But it is also the only path to true growth. As you navigate the years ahead, you will face choices and challenges that you cannot possibly anticipate today. Don't be afraid to try, to fail, and to try again. Because success, the most profound and lasting kind, doesn't start with a perfect plan. It always starts with a willingness to adapt. That was a summary of Adapt by Tim Harford. We've explored the main highways of his argument today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. The real magic happens when you walk the trails yourself. It's in the quiet moments, when a particular story or a simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is designed to help you decide if this book is worth your time and attention. If anything we've talked about today has made you curious, if it's sparked a new idea or challenged an old assumption, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's an experience that can genuinely change how you see the world and your own place within it. The link to the book is in the description below. Also, if you found this journey valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It tells us we're on the right path, and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book. Let's keep learning and growing together.